In the winter of 1581, in a cold stone castle near the Rhine, a 50-year-old woman was dying, and the only one of her children who came to sit beside her was the daughter everyone at court was a little afraid of. The room was at Hambach, a Renaissance hunting palace her husband had built when he still had the use of his whole body and most of his mind. Maria of Austria had been a Habsburg by blood, an archduchess, the daughter of an emperor. She had married into a wealthy duchy on the Lower Rhine and given it 7 children. And by the time she lay there in December, she had watched the men in her family come apart one piece at a time, and she had started, slowly and quietly, to come apart herself. The German sources use a gentle word for what happened to her: schwermütig, heavy-spirited, melancholic. At first, only sometimes, they say, and then all the time. Welcome in, by the way. If you're new here, this channel is where we sit down with the strange, sad, and frequently horrifying corners of history that don't make it into the textbooks, and we take our time with them. And before we get going, do me a quick favor and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. I genuinely love reading those. It's one of the best parts of doing this. If you've been around a while, thank you. Sincerely, you keep this whole thing alive. Now settle in, because this one is a long, dark walk through one family's collapse, and Maria is standing right at the center of it. Her story starts in Prague on the 15th of May, 1531. She was born into the Habsburg world of Central European royalty, the 5th child of a man who was, at that point, still the king of Bohemia and Hungary, and the younger brother of the most powerful monarch in Christendom. Her father was Ferdinand, the man who would eventually become Holy Roman Emperor, and her mother was Anna of Bohemia and Hungary, a Jagiellonian princess whose marriage had stitched 2 crowns onto the Habsburg map. Maria came into a family that was, even by the standards of the age, enormous: 15 children. Her mother bore 15 children across roughly 20 years, and the brutal weight of that became part of the family's story before Maria was even old enough to understand it. Because here is what happened to her mother. Anna gave birth to her 15th child in January of 1547, a daughter named Joanna, and 3 days later Anna was dead. 43 years old, possibly 44, gone from complications of a delivery that the body simply could not survive after 15 of them. Maria was 15 herself when this happened, old enough to feel it fully. Her father never remarried. He had what he needed: an heir and a long row of daughters to marry off into useful alliances, and Anna had spent her body completely producing them. Almost all 15 survived to adulthood, which was extraordinary, and almost all of them were turned into marriages. That was the function. That was, in a very literal sense, what these women were for. 15 pregnancies in 20 years tells you the world Maria grew up inside. A woman who was carrying, or recovering from carrying, for most of her adult life, a body in near constant use as a machine for producing heirs and bargaining chips. The Bohemian and Hungarian crowns that Anna brought into the family had a desperate need for heirs, so her fertility was prized, watched, celebrated. And in the end it killed her, the way it killed so many royal women, not in a battle or a poisoning or a dramatic court intrigue, but quietly, in a birthing bed, of the simple accumulated damage of doing the one thing she was most valued for. Maria watched her mother live and die that way. And then Maria was raised to do the same. She would grow up, marry, and bear 7 children of her own, and she would not die in childbirth the way her mother had, but the body she'd been trained to spend would be spent all the same, on a marriage and a duchy, and a household that took everything from her by other means. She had a small army of siblings, and the older sisters were already being slotted into the marriage market as Maria was growing up. One became Queen of Poland, another would marry into the Dukes of Bavaria, another into Mantua. The daughters of Ferdinand were scattered across the map of Catholic Europe like a hand of cards being dealt, each one placed where she could do the most diplomatic good. Nothing about Maria's eventual fate was unusual in that context. She was simply one card in a very large hand, and the question was never whether she'd be married off, only to whom, and for what. I should say something here about the bloodline since it shapes the way Maria's story gets told. Maria was a granddaughter of Joanna of Castile. You might know her better by the name history hung on her, Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, the Castilian queen who spent decades shut away, sometimes refusing to let her dead husband be buried, kept under lock and key by her own father and then her own son. Maria's father Ferdinand was Joanna's son. So the woman we're following carried, in her veins, a direct line back to the most famous case of royal madness in Europe. People love that detail. They love to draw a clean line from Joanna's locked room to Maria's heavy spirits and say, look, it ran in the family, it was always going to surface. And it's a genuinely tempting line to draw. I'd just gently flag that it's a line drawn after the fact, by people who already knew how the story ended. The blood connection is real. What it actually caused is a lot murkier, and we'll get there. Joanna is the shadow the whole story is told under, so she's worth a moment of her own. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the famous Catholic monarchs of Spain, and she was, by most accounts, intelligent, well-educated, and deeply, ruinously in love with her husband, Philip the Handsome. When he died young, something in her broke. The stories say she would not let his coffin be buried, that she travelled with the body, opening the casket to look at him. Whether that was grief curdled into illness or a sane woman's mourning weaponized by ambitious men who wanted her out of the way, historians still argue about. Her father confined her, then her son confined her. She spent something like 46 years shut away in a castle at Tordesillas, and she died there. That's the woman whose blood ran down into Maria 2 generations later, on the Rhine. Maria almost certainly never met her great-grandmother's ghost, so to speak. But the family knew the story. Everyone knew the story. And it sat in the background of a dynasty that kept marrying its own relatives and kept producing minds that came apart. As a child, she was educated the way a Habsburg daughter was educated, which meant religion first and everything else second. She and her sisters were raised firmly Catholic, taught their languages, German and Italian and Latin and French, taught to play keyboard instruments and to dance. One regional historian who went looking through the descriptions of her found her called small for her age, well-mannered, attractive in spite of the heavy Habsburg features that ran in the family. Not a scholar, he said, but teachable. Not a beauty, but not without it either. The portrait that comes through is of a pleasant, pious, unremarkable girl, the sort of daughter who would cause no trouble and could be handed across a border to seal a deal. And that is exactly what was done with her. The Catholic part of that upbringing isn't a small detail to skip past, because it became the spine of her whole adult life. The Reformation was tearing through the German lands while Maria was a girl. Luther had been dead only a year when her mother died. Whole territories were swinging Protestant, princes were converting, monasteries were being dissolved, and the old religious certainty that the Habsburgs built their power on was cracking everywhere. Ferdinand's daughters were raised as soldiers of the old faith, taught their devotions rigorously, taught that the church was not negotiable. Maria absorbed that completely. It made her, and later it may have helped break her. She grew up between the Hofburg in Vienna and the family's other residences, in a court that ran on ceremony and Catholic ritual and the constant low hum of diplomacy. These were not idle, pampered childhoods. The daughters of an emperor were assets being prepared, and part of being prepared was learning to be agreeable, devout, dignified, and useful. A girl who could sit through long masses, speak to ambassadors in 3 languages, and not embarrass the family, was a girl who could be married well. Maria, by every indication, was exactly that girl. Quiet, kind, faithful, manageable. The deal had everything to do with a war her future husband had lost. His name was William, Duke of Jülich-Klevsburg, and depending on which source you read, he gets called William V or William the Rich. And the rich part was earned, because the lands he ruled were some of the wealthiest and most strategically placed in the whole German northwest. A tangle of duchies along the lower Rhine, sitting right where the Holy Roman Empire brushed up against the Low Countries. William had inherited a strong hand and then overplayed it. He'd acquired the Duchy of Guelders, which the Emperor Charles V, Maria's uncle, regarded as his by right. So they went to war over it, and it went very badly for William. In 1543, the Emperor's army marched, took the town of Düren and burned through it, and William folded almost immediately. The Treaty of Venlo, September of 1543, stripped him of Guelders and Zutphen and forced him to crawl back into the Catholic fold and promise to stop flirting with the Reformation he had lost. And the way you sealed a loss like that, the way the Habsburgs preferred to bind a defeated prince to them, was with a marriage. A niece of the emperor planted in his bed and his household to keep him loyal and Catholic and quiet. What happened at Düren set the tone for everything. Charles V's forces took the town and put it to fire and sword, the kind of brutal, exemplary destruction a 16th century army used to make a point, to show a wavering duke exactly what disobedience cost. The message to William was simple and physical. This is what I can do to your lands. This is what I will do to all of it if you keep resisting. And William, who had inherited his territories partly through clever marriage and partly through opportunistic land grabbing, looked at the burning town and surrendered everything he'd reached too far for. The man Maria was about to marry had just been publicly, militarily humbled by her own uncle. That niece was Maria. The negotiations ran through the Imperial Diet at Regensburg, and there's a small, slightly grim detail in how the match was made. William was apparently offered a choice between Maria and her older sister Anna. He preferred Anna. But Anna was already promised elsewhere, so he took Maria instead. The way you take the available option when the one you wanted is gone. The marriage treaty was dated the 17th of July, 1546, and they were married the very next day, the 18th of July in Regensburg, with the emperor himself in attendance. Maria was 15. William was about to turn 30. He was twice her age, a defeated duke being handed a teenage bride as part of his punishment and his rehabilitation. And buried in that wedding contract was a clause that nobody in the room could have known would one day set fire to half of Europe. The emperor granted William a special privilege. If William's male line ever died out, his daughters would be allowed to inherit. Female succession, a safety valve, a piece of generosity, a little gift to smooth the humiliation of the marriage. Hold that somewhere in the back of your mind, because 60 years later, it becomes the detonator. William had been married once before, and that earlier marriage casts a strange shadow over Maria's whole life. As a younger man, he'd been betrothed to Jeanne d'Albret, the heiress of Navarre, when she was about 12 years old. She was famously, violently opposed to the match. The story goes that she had to be physically carried to the altar because she refused to walk, and the marriage was never consummated, partly because of her age and partly because of her resistance. It was annulled by the Pope in 1545, clean and final, on the grounds that nothing had ever happened between them. So when William married Maria a year later, he was, in the eyes of the church and everyone else, a free and unmarried man. Jeanne's resistance is one of those rare moments where a royal girl's actual feelings punch through the polite record. She wrote, or had written for her, formal protests declaring that any marriage forced on her would be against her will and therefore invalid. She is supposed to have been beaten over her refusal. When the day came, she would not walk to the ceremony, and a man had to carry her there bodily so the wedding could proceed at all. She was a child being dragged into a marriage she despised, and she fought it with everything a 12-year-old had. That ferocity, by the way, never left her. Jeanne d'Albret grew up to become one of the most formidable Protestant queens in Europe, the mother of the king who would eventually unite France. But to William she was a brief, humiliating, unconsummated first marriage that the Pope erased. Remember that the marriage to Jeanne was never consummated, because years and years later, this becomes the seed of something that eats away at Maria's mind. For a long time, though, the marriage worked. By the standards of arranged dynastic unions, it was even a happy one. The court lived mostly at Düsseldorf, with Hambach Castle near Jülich as a favourite retreat, a place William rebuilt in the new Renaissance style in the years right after the wedding. Maria settled into her role. She was Catholic and devout in a duchy that was drifting, confessionally, all over the place, and she became the anchor of the Catholic side of the household. William's sister was Anne of Cleves, the same Anne of Cleves who had briefly been Queen of England, married and then very quickly unmarried by Henry VIII. Anne approved of her brother's new wife and sent a gift from England, 2 horses and a couple of braces of greyhounds. A small, friendly gesture from the most famous member of the family, the sister-in-law who had walked away from Henry Tudor with her head still attached. That detail about Anne of Cleves puts Maria's marriage in strange company. Anne had been pulled out of this same family, this same Cleves household, and shipped to England to marry the most dangerous husband in Europe, only to be discarded within months when Henry decided he didn't want her. She got lucky. In the brutal logic of that court, she survived, kept her head, got a comfortable settlement, and lived out her life in England as the king's honorary sister. And now here she was, years later, sending horses and hunting dogs across the sea to welcome her brother's young Habsburg bride. One Cleves woman who'd escaped a catastrophic marriage, blessing another woman entering a marriage that would slowly turn into a catastrophe of a different kind. Anne got out. Maria was just arriving. Maria was 15. Married to a man twice her age who'd wanted her sister, in a foreign duchy on the far side of the empire from everything she'd known. She had a job to do, the same job her mother had done and her sisters were doing, produce heirs and anchor the alliance. And for roughly 20 years, before the strokes came for her husband, she did it inside what was, genuinely, one of the better marriages in the dynastic world. They had 7 children together. The court was prosperous and intellectually lively. William, before his collapse, was an active and capable duke. By the cold standards of arranged royal marriage, Maria had drawn a relatively kind hand. The teenage bride handed over as the price of a war had landed somewhere she could build a life. For a while. So the early years are, genuinely, the good part. William's court at this point was one of the more interesting places in the empire. He'd built a reputation as a moderate, a man who tried to hold a middle line between Catholic and Protestant in an age when that middle line was getting people killed. His own personal physician, hired in 1550, was a man named Johann Weyer, and Weyer is a genuinely important figure because while he was living and working at William's court, he wrote one of the first major books arguing against the witch hunts. He wrote it at Hambach Castle, the same castle where Maria would one day die, and he dedicated it to William, a duke whose household physician was, at that very moment, trying to convince Europe to stop burning women alive on charges of witchcraft. That's the texture of the place in the good years. Humane, curious, tolerant, prosperous. Weyer's book tells you how unusual this court was. All across Europe, women were being accused of witchcraft, tortured into confessions, and burned. The standard intellectual position of the age was that witches were real, that they made pacts with the devil, and that they had to be hunted down and destroyed. Weyer looked at the women being dragged in front of these courts and saw something different. He saw old women, confused women, melancholic women, sick and poor and frightened women, people whose minds or bodies were failing, being tortured into admitting to crimes that existed only in their accusers' imaginations. He argued that they were ill, not evil, that what looked like demonic possession was very often mental illness, that the real danger wasn't the witches, but the men hunting them. And he wrote all of this under the protection of William, in the castle where Maria lived, and dedicated it to the duke who let him say it. Hold that against what the same family would be doing 50 years later when they brought in a priest to exorcise the demons out of Maria's mad son. The court that once sheltered the man who said madness was illness, not possession, would end up trying to cast devils out of its own duke. The whole trajectory of this story sits in that reversal. And Maria did what she was sent there to do. She had children, 7 of them across the years, 6 of whom lived to grow up. And those 6 children are the heart of this whole grim story. So we're going to go through them one at a time, because what happens to them is the real weight of Maria's life. One daughter, Elizabeth, died at around 5 years old, and the records pass over her quickly, the way they pass over so many small early deaths. The 6 who survived each carried a piece of the family's unraveling. A word about that lost daughter, Elizabeth, even though the records barely pause for her. A child dead at 5. In the cold accounting of dynastic history, she's a single line, a name and 2 dates close together, easy to skip. But she was a real little girl who lived 5 years in that household and then died. And Maria carried her in her body and bore her and buried her, the first of the children she would lose. Childhood death was so common in this world that it barely registered in the official record, but it registered in the mothers. Maria would bury a 5-year-old daughter and decades later a 19-year-old son, and watch the rest of her surviving children walk into fates that were, in their own ways, just as much losses. The record gives Elizabeth 1 line. I'd give her a little more than that. She was there, briefly, a small living person in that household, and then she wasn't. And her mother went on bearing the children who would carry the family's ruin forward. Start with the one who broke Maria's heart first. Karl Friedrich was the eldest son, born in 1555, and by every account he was the bright spot, the answer to everything. Where his father was steady and his younger brother would turn out to be fragile, Karl Friedrich was vital, sharp, full of life. He was the heir, the future of the duchy, the one who would carry the family forward and rule all that rich Rhineland territory. In 1571, when he was a teenager, he was sent off on the great educational tour of the age, down through Italy with a learned tutor named Stephanus Pigius, who later wrote the whole journey up into what amounts to one of the first travel guidebooks to Italy. You can feel the pride in it, the careful documentation of this brilliant young prince being shown the wonders of the South, prepared for greatness. The timing put him in Rome for the Holy Year of 1575. He was an honored guest of Pope Gregory XIII. On Christmas Eve of 1574, he helped open the Holy Door at St. Peter's, a tremendous honor, the future ruler of a strategically vital Catholic duchy being shown off to the whole Catholic world. A week later, the Pope gave him the consecrated sword and hat, a gift normally reserved for kings. The message was unmistakable. Rome was investing in this young man. Rome wanted him bound tight to the Counter-Reformation, wanted him to grow up and rule his rich German lands as a loyal son of the Church. He was 19 years old, and the whole future was opening up in front of him. You can feel, across the centuries, how much was riding on this boy. His father had once flirted with Protestantism and been beaten back into line. The duchy sat on the fault line of the whole confessional war, and here was the heir, young, brilliant, devout, being personally blessed by the Pope and handed the sword of a king. If Karl Friedrich came home and ruled, the duchy was secure, Catholic, prosperous, the future settled. Everyone who looked at him saw the problem solved. His mother, holding the household together around his disabled father, must have looked at the reports from Rome and felt something close to relief. The bright one was nearly grown. The bright one was going to be fine. Then he went down to Naples, and in Naples he caught smallpox. He came back to Rome already sick, and he got worse. The Pope sent his own best physicians, the finest medical men in the city, and they could do nothing. Smallpox in the 16th century was a death you watched happen slowly. The fever came first, then the aching, then the rash spreading across the face and the body, the spots rising into blisters and then into pustules, dense and burning, until the skin was a single mass of erupting sores. The patient burned with fever, raved, suffered, while everyone around them prayed and applied useless remedies and waited. For a strong young man, it could go either way. For Karl Friedrich, it went the wrong way. In early February of 1575, he died in Rome, 19 years old, far from home, the brilliant heir who had just been crowned with papal honors a few weeks earlier. Gregory paid for the funeral himself, a magnificent one, and had him entombed in the German National Church in the city. The Pope had lost his investment. Think about the cruelty of the timing. Christmas Eve, the holy door, the king's sword, the whole Catholic world watching this young prince step into his future. And 6 weeks later, he's a corpse covered in smallpox scars in a Roman sick room, being buried by a pope who'd hoped to make him the Counter-Reformation's man on the Rhine. The distance between those two scenes is barely a month. That's how fast it could happen. That's how thin the thread was that every dynasty hung from. And Maria, back on the Rhine, had lost her son and the future of her entire family in one stroke. Because here is the thing that makes Karl Friedrich's death the hinge of everything. He was the capable one. With him gone, the whole inheritance, the whole future of the duchy fell onto the shoulders of his younger brother. And the younger brother was not well. One regional account puts it about as bluntly as you can put it. If Karl Friedrich had lived, there would have been no war. The catastrophe that swallowed this family decades later traces straight back to a teenage boy dying of smallpox in a Roman sick room in 1575. The news would have reached Dusseldorf weeks later, carried by rider across the passes and down the Rhine. A mother already nursing a broken husband, already running a duchy she had no legal right to run. Opening a letter to learn that her brilliant son, the one who was going to fix everything, had died of disease in a city she would never see. One of her surviving daughters, Anna, wrote to her grandfather around this time with anxious condolences, worrying over the family, sending small remedies. The grief moved through the whole family in letters, slow and helpless. And underneath the grief was the cold, practical fact that the future now rested on Johann Wilhelm, the fragile second son who had been raised to be a bishop, and who would, 15 years later, lose his mind entirely. Maria buried that grief and kept going, because there were 5 other children and a duchy to hold together. The others are worth walking through one by one. And I'll warn you now, the pattern that emerges is hard to look at directly. The eldest of all her children was a daughter, Marie Eleanor, born in 1550. She grew up clever and strong-willed, and to her father's alarm she developed firm Lutheran sympathies, encouraged by a Protestant aunt who had a hand in raising the girls. In a duchy trying to stay officially Catholic, a Protestant-leaning eldest daughter was a problem, and William wanted her married off to a Protestant prince quickly to get her out of the household and stop her influence rubbing off on her younger sisters. The available match was Albert Frederick, the Duke of Prussia. And Albert Frederick, even at the time of the marriage negotiations, was already showing signs that something was deeply wrong with his mind. They married in 1573 in Königsberg. By the next year, the year Karl Friedrich died, her husband was unraveling. He had been showing mental disturbance since around 1572. He had twice tried to kill himself. He was prone to sudden violent outbursts, and he was gripped by an obsessive, consuming terror that Turks and Muscovites were about to come pouring over the borders and overrun all of Germany. A fear that never left him, and that the people around him could not talk him out of. Within a few years he was declared incompetent to rule, placed under the regency of a cousin, and he never recovered. He lived on for decades in what one description calls complete mental derangement, dying in 1618 without a surviving son. Picture the marriage from her side. She arrives in Königsberg, a young woman from the Rhine sent east to a duke she's barely met. And within a year or two it becomes clear that the man she's married is losing his mind. The suicide attempts, the rages that come from nowhere, the fixed, unshakable terror of invading armies that exist mostly in his head. A husband who cannot be reasoned with, cannot be trusted to govern, cannot at times be safely left alone, and who is going to be exactly this way for the rest of his very long life. She was, in effect, married to an illness, and she was expected to manage it and the duchy around it, and to do it with composure for over 40 years. And she did. A quiet astonishment on its own. Marie Eleanor ran the affairs of Prussia in the shadow of her husband's madness. She handled what needed handling, and crucially, she arranged the marriages of her own daughters with real political skill, marrying them into the powerful Hohenzollern House of Brandenburg. Through her eldest daughter, the claim to all of Maria's husband's lands, the whole rich Jülich-Cleves inheritance, would eventually pass to the Elector of Brandenburg. So this daughter, the one handed to a mad duke to get her out of the way, ended up being the channel through which her family's lands flowed into what would one day become the Kingdom of Prussia. The girl shipped east to manage someone else's broken mind quietly became one of the most consequential figures in the whole story. So Maria's eldest daughter spent her entire adult life married to a man whose mind had collapsed, managing the affairs of a duchy around a husband who could not be trusted to govern or even, at times, to be left alone. She was good at it. She handled the administration. She arranged excellent marriages for her own daughters into the Hohenzollern family, and through one of those daughters the claim to all of Maria's husband's lands eventually passed to Brandenburg, which becomes important later. But step back and look at the shape of it. Maria's eldest child was yoked for life to a man losing his mind, and she was not the only one. The second daughter, Anna, born in 1552, got the gentler fate, relatively speaking. Raised leaning Lutheran like her sister, she was married in 1574 to Philip Louis, the Count Palatine of Neuburg, and her father personally escorted her to a lavish wedding. It was a long marriage, around 40 years, and it produced 8 children. By the standards of this family, that's almost a happy ending. Some of her letters survive, a daughter writing to her father with anxious condolences after her brother Karl Friedrich's death in Rome, worrying about her father's health, even sending him quince juice as a small remedy. Through this daughter's line, through her son, a major claim to the inheritance would later run, and that son would eventually secure a chunk of the lands. But in Maria's lifetime, Anna was simply the daughter whose marriage actually worked. There's something almost poignant about Anna being the lucky one, when all she got was an ordinary marriage. 40 years, 8 children, a husband who didn't go mad, a household that functioned. In any other family that would be unremarkable, the baseline expectation. In this one, it stands out like a single lit window in a dark street. Anna got to live a normal, aristocratic life, and the fact that this makes her the fortunate child tells you everything about what happened to her siblings. Her letters are the warmest thing we have from any of Maria's children. Those small, worried notes about her father's health, the quince juice sent across the miles as a homely little gesture of care. A daughter who loved her family and got to keep loving them in peace, the only one. The third surviving daughter, Magdalene, born in 1553, married Anna's brother-in-law, John I of Zweibrücken, in 1579. Another Palatine match, another claim to the inheritance planted for the future, several more children. And there's a small, dark symmetry in where Magdalene ends up because she eventually dies at Hambach Castle in 1633, the same castle where her mother died. This family kept ending up in the same cold rooms. 2 of Maria's daughters then married into the same Palatine family, 2 brothers, and both of those marriages planted claims that would later fight over the inheritance. The daughters were doing exactly what their mother had done, what their grandmother had done, being placed into marriages that served the family's strategic interests, producing children who became chess pieces in the next generation's games. And Magdalene, after a long life, came back to die in Hambach, in the castle where Maria had taken her last breath 52 years earlier. The walls that watch the mother die, heavy-spirited, watch the daughter die too. There's no meaning to impose on that, just the plain fact of it. A family that kept ending up in the same handful of stone rooms by the Rhine. Then there's Sibylle, born in 1557, and Sibylla is a different kind of figure entirely, because she's the one who survives the collapse and turns hard in the surviving. She stayed unmarried for a long time, and as the family fell apart around her, as her brother lost his mind and the court at Dusseldorf descended into faction and paranoia, Sibylla became the dominant force there, the most ruthless person in the room. She made herself the bitter enemy of her sister-in-law, engineered that woman's imprisonment, and is widely believed to have had a hand in her violent death. That whole episode comes a little later, and it's one of the worst things in the entire account. Sibylle is the daughter who hardened, the one standing at her mother's deathbed in 1581, the one who would go on to do terrible things in the wreckage. She finally married late, in 1601, a cousin, and lived out her years keeping a feudal court and patronizing music, a strangely refined coda for someone with her reputation. Sibylle is the one who shows you what surviving this family did to a person. She watched her father turn into a paralyzed invalid. She watched her brilliant brother die in Rome. She watched her surviving brother lose his mind. She was the only one of the children at her mother's deathbed, the one who sat with Maria at the end while the others stayed away. And then, in the years after, as the court collapsed into a leaderless scramble for power around a mad duke, Sibylle didn't break the way her mother had. She hardened. She made herself the strongest figure in a court full of frightened, scheming people, and she used that strength to destroy a rival, to help put a woman in a tower and, by most accounts, to see her dead. The same family pressure that drove Maria into melancholy and Johann Wilhelm into madness drove Sibylle into something cold and ruthless and entirely functional. She didn't go mad. She got dangerous. Whether that's a better fate or just a different one, I'll leave to you. And then there's the last son, Johann Wilhelm, born in 1562. The one the video title is really about, in a way, even though it's his mother's name on it. The one who went, by every measure available to us, completely and irreversibly insane. He wasn't supposed to rule anything. With his brilliant older brother Karl Friedrich alive and being crowned with papal swords in Rome, Johann Wilhelm was the spare, the second son. And second sons of Catholic dukes went into the church, so that's where they put him. From the age of 9, he was raised at a collegiate foundation, made a canon of Cologne Cathedral as a boy, and by his early teens he was installed as the bishop, or more precisely, the administrator of Münster, a churchman. Sickly and weak next to his vigorous brother, but fine for a quiet ecclesiastical career, the future everyone had mapped out for him. Then Karl Friedrich died in that Roman sick room, and the whole plan inverted. The fragile second son, the one earmarked for a bishop's quiet life, was suddenly the only heir to one of the richest territorial complexes in the empire. They pulled him out of the church track and started preparing him to be a duke. And the strain of that, or maybe just the timing of his own internal decline meeting that pressure, sat at the edge of everything that came after. Think about what that reversal asked of him. He'd spent his whole boyhood being shaped for the church, raised at a collegiate foundation from the age of 9, made a canon, installed as a bishop while still a teenager. That was the entire shape of his expected life. Quiet, ecclesiastical, secondary. The duchy, the marriage, the heir-making, the governing, all of that belonged to his brilliant older brother. And then, almost overnight, his brother is a corpse in Rome, and the whole weight of the dynasty drops onto him. The sickly one, the spare. He has to be unmade as a bishop and remade as a duke, has to marry, has to produce an heir, has to govern lands that the great powers are circling. Whether the pressure caused his breakdown or merely coincided with it, no one can say for certain. But the boy raised to be quiet and secondary was handed everything, and within a few years of being handed it, his mind came apart. For a while it looked like it might work. In 1585 they married him to Jacobe of Baden, and the wedding was staggering. One of the most lavish princely weddings of the entire late Renaissance. 8 days of festivities in Düsseldorf, documented by a court scribe with engravings produced to commemorate the whole thing. The sources argue a little over the guest count, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 noble guests, a sea of velvet and gold pouring into Dusseldorf to celebrate the heir's marriage and the future of the dynasty. It must have looked, for 8 glittering days, like the family was going to be fine. The scale of it tells you how desperate the stakes were underneath the celebration. 8 full days, tournaments, banquets, processions, fireworks, the whole arsenal of Renaissance princely display unloaded onto one wedding. They hired a scribe to write it all down and an engraver's workshop to illustrate it so that the magnificence would be remembered. And the thing being celebrated under all that gold was a single fragile hope that this marriage would produce an heir and secure the line, that the sickly second son who'd been pulled out of the church to replace his dead brother would father a child and the dynasty would survive. They threw the most magnificent party they could afford at the problem, as if enough velvet and trumpets could make it true. Maria was a few years from her own death by this point, having buried Karl Friedrich a decade earlier. Whether she watched her surviving son's wedding with hope or with the dread of someone who had seen too much go wrong, the record doesn't say. She would not live to see how it ended. But signs of something wrong in Johann Wilhelm's mind were already showing by 1588, 1589. An anxious, heavy melancholy took hold of him in the spring of 1589 and then came on harder over that summer. And on the first day of 1590, the new year, the illness broke fully open. Within weeks, he had fallen into what the German sources call Tobsucht, raving mania. After that, he was, plainly and without much dispute, insane, and he stayed that way for nearly 20 years until his death. What did the insanity look like? The descriptions that survive paint a man tormented by 2 tangled obsessions. One was a confused, grandiose religious ambition, a drive to stamp out Protestant heresy and to seize power away from his own father. The other was a deepening terror that he was the target of conspiracies, that people were plotting to assassinate him, that enemies were closing in. Persecutory delusions wrapped around delusions of grandeur. Modern writers looking back at the symptoms have reached for words like manic depressive, bipolar, swinging between frenzied mania and crushing lows, and they note that later on he seems to have slid towards something more like catatonia, a kind of frozen withdrawal. He was childless. The Jülich lands around him were being trampled by Spanish and Dutch troops fighting their own wars across his territory, and his mind was eating itself the whole time. There's a particular horror in the shape of his illness, in the way it took the very things his role demanded and twisted them. A duke was supposed to be devout, so his madness made him a fanatic, raving about heresy. A duke was supposed to hold power, so his madness made him try to seize it violently from his own dying father. A duke was supposed to be wary of his enemies, so his madness filled the world with assassins who weren't there. The illness didn't replace his identity, it parodied it, took the duties drilled into him since he was pulled out of the bishop's seat and inflated them into delusions. And he lived inside that for nearly 2 decades, raving and terrified, in a duchy that armies marched across at will while its duke screamed about plots in the castle. Now, his father was still alive through the early part of this, and his father was no longer in any condition to manage a mad son, because William the Rich had been broken years before. So I want to go back and pick up William's own collapse, because it ran in parallel with all of this, and because it's the other great horror sitting at the center of Maria's life. Two men in her family, her husband and her son, losing their bodies and their minds while she watched. William's collapse came in the summer of 1566. He was at the Imperial Diet in Augsburg, doing the ordinary work of an imperial prince, and one evening he had a stroke, apoplexy in the language of the time. It left him paralyzed down the left side of his body, and it damaged his speech permanently. He was 50 years old, and it was only the first one. More strokes followed over the years that came. On top of the paralysis, he developed a loss of bone tissue and a compression of the spine, so that simply standing or sitting upright for any length of time became an ordeal of pain. The portraits tell the story without needing words. The early images show a striking, commanding figure. A tall man, around 6 feet, every inch a ruling duke. The late ones show someone visibly ravaged, hollowed out, a body in slow ruin. A stroke in the 16th century was a complete mystery and a complete sentence. Nobody understood what had happened inside his skull, that a vessel had burst or clotted and starved part of his brain. They saw only the result, a man who had been whole the day before, and now had half a body that would not obey him and a mouth that would not form words cleanly. No treatment existed, no therapy, no rehabilitation, nothing but bleeding and prayer, and the slow, grim work of keeping him alive and as comfortable as a ruined body could be made. And then it happened again, and again. Each stroke taking a little more, each one leaving him further from the man he'd been. The spinal compression and bone loss on top of it meant that even resting hurt, that there was no position he could hold without pain. He had perhaps 26 years of this ahead of him. And the cruelty is that he kept some awareness through much of it. A stroke that damages the body and the speech doesn't always erase the mind, at least not at first. So there were years where William was trapped inside a failing body, unable to speak clearly, unable to move freely, watching his duchy slide into faction around his sickbed, watching his eldest son die in Rome, watching his second son inherit a future the boy wasn't equipped for, and eventually watching, or at least being present for, that second son's descent into madness. A ruined man, conscious of the ruin, presiding in name over a court that was governing around him because he no longer could. His wife managing what she could without authority, his counselors circling, his mind in the later years increasingly clouded by the accumulating strokes, until the awareness itself mercifully dimmed. From 1566 onward, William could not really govern. No formal regency was ever set up, and that created its own problem, because power just sort of drained away from the Duke into the hands of his councillors and the territorial estates, and nobody had clear authority. And into that vacuum, quietly, stepped Maria. She managed things. She handled administration and finances during her husband's incapacities, did the work that needed doing to keep a duchy running around a man who could barely speak and could not stand without pain. But because there was no official regency, no legal grant of power, every decision she made was exposed to challenge from the councils and the estates. She had responsibility without authority, about the worst position you can put a person in. She used what influence she had to reinforce Catholicism and to keep her children raised strictly Catholic, fighting the confessional drift of the whole region from inside a household where the Duke was a paralyzed shadow. For something like 26 years, from that first stroke in 1566 until his death in 1592, William endured progressive disability, a long, slow physical disintegration, while the world he'd ruled hardened into faction around his sickbed. Maria lived through 15 of those years. From the first stroke in 1566 until her own death in 1581, she was the wife of a man who needed managing and the unofficial manager of a duchy that wouldn't let her manage it properly. Every day the same impossible arrangement, a husband who couldn't rule and couldn't be replaced, a government she had to run but had no right to run, councillors who would let her do the work and then question her authority to have done it, religious factions pulling the duchy apart while she tried to hold it Catholic, and her own children growing up, being married off, dying, descending into illness, the whole catalogue of the family's misfortunes unfolding around her while she held the centre together with no real power to do it. It would wear anyone down. The sources say it wore her down into melancholy and then into something worse. So look at where Maria is by the late 1570s. Her husband has been a paralyzed, speech-impaired invalid for over a decade and is still slowly worsening. Her bright eldest son is dead of smallpox in Rome. Her eldest daughter is married to a man whose mind has collapsed, and her surviving son, the heir, is a fragile, sickly young man who is just a few years away from his own descent into raving madness. This is the household she was holding together. This is the weight she was under when the German sources say she began to grow heavy-spirited. The records on Maria herself are thin. What survives is mostly second-hand and vague. The German accounts say she was considered schwermütig, melancholic, and that she became, in their phrasing, at first temporarily and then entirely deranged. That's the strongest claim, and it traces back to a 19th century medical yearbook rather than to any detailed contemporary account of specific behavior. An English-language account, drawing on a regional German history, describes her spending the last years of her life in mental derangement and calls her a delicate woman of great kindness of heart who came to need care. And there is one specific, haunting detail offered for what tipped her over. A report attributed to a cardinal named Commendon says that the pious woman tormented herself with a scruple, a religious doubt that ate at her, the belief that her marriage to William could not be legitimate because William had been married before to Jeanne d'Albret and, she feared, had consummated that earlier marriage. If that were true, then her own marriage would be invalid, bigamous, and her children illegitimate in the eyes of God. Worry, pain, and doubt, the report says, shattered her mind. Sit with how that torment works on a deeply religious mind. Maria had been raised, from girlhood, to believe the Church's rules were not negotiable, that sin was real and damnation was real, and the state of your soul was the most important thing about you. So when a doubt about the validity of her marriage took root, it landed on her not as an abstract legal question. It was a question about whether she had spent her entire adult life in sin, whether every night with her husband had been adultery in the eyes of God, whether her 7 children, the children she'd born and buried and married off and watched suffer, were illegitimate, stained, conceived in a union God did not recognize. For a woman with her faith, that's not a worry. It's a horror that touches everything, and once it takes hold, you can't reason your way out of it, because the fear isn't really about the facts, it's about guilt that has found a place to attach itself. Here's what makes that detail land the way it does. We know that William's marriage to Jeanne was never consummated. That was the whole basis for its annulment. So Maria's scruple, if she really had it, was a torment built on something that wasn't even true. A devout woman, surrounded by collapse, lying awake at Hambach, convincing herself that her entire marriage and all her children were a sin against God, over a thing that had never actually happened. That's not the madness of a curse leaping down through the blood from Joanna of Castile. That's the slow grinding of a religious, anxious mind under unbearable grief and fear, fixing on a false guilt and refusing to let it go. Whether you call that insanity or call it something else, it's a real and recognizable form of human suffering. And it's the one that actually seems to have taken Maria. The cruelty of it is that the very thing that should have comforted her was the thing she couldn't reach. The annulment was real. The non-consummation was the documented, church-sanctioned reason for it. By every standard of canon law, her marriage was valid and her children were legitimate, and any priest she asked could have told her so. But that's the nature of the torment the report describes. It doesn't respond to reassurance. You can tell a mind caught in that kind of religious dread the truth 100 times, and it will find 100 reasons to doubt it. The guilt isn't looking for evidence, it's looking for somewhere to live, and it found a home in an old, annulled marriage and refused to be evicted. So Maria suffered over a sin that existed only in her own frightened conscience, while the documents that would have freed her sat unread in some chancery, true and useless. To William's stroke-shattered brain and to Johann Wilhelm's screaming delusions, Maria's was the quiet kind, the melancholic kind, the kind that creeps in around the edges of a woman who has buried a child, nursed a paralyzed husband for 15 years, and can see her last son starting to slip. The kind nobody writes a vivid account of, because it doesn't rave or attack anyone, it just sinks, slowly, into the dark. I don't say that to take the drama out of her story. There isn't any drama to take out. The story is plenty dark on its own. The quiet sort of breakdown is, in some ways, the one that gets overlooked. The men in her family broke loudly. William raved in his stroke-clouded confusion. Johann Wilhelm screamed about assassins and had to be locked away and exorcised. And so the record is full of vivid, terrible scenes of them. Maria broke quietly. She got heavy. She got sad in a way that didn't lift. She fixed on a guilt that wasn't real and couldn't be talked out of it. And then she died. 50 years old, of an illness no one named, with one daughter beside her. No dramatic scenes of Maria's madness survive because her madness was never dramatic. A woman slowly going under while everyone's attention was on the men making noise. That happens. It still happens, and the deepest cruelty in her particular version of it is how reasonable it was. She wasn't undone by some mysterious inherited taint flaring up out of nowhere. She was undone by her actual life, by burying her children, by nursing a ruined husband for a decade and a half, by carrying responsibility she was never given the authority to carry, by a faith that turned its own weapons on her. If you took a sound, kind, ordinary woman and put her through exactly what Maria went through, year after year, loss after loss, you would not be surprised if her mind eventually buckled. The surprise would be if it didn't. So maybe the blood of Joanna of Castile had something to do with it, and maybe it didn't. But you don't actually need a curse to explain a woman breaking under that much weight. The weight is enough. She died on the 11th of December 1581 at Hambach Castle, 50 years old. Her husband outlived her by a decade, which means she never had to watch his final years, and she died before her son Johann Wilhelm's mind fully shattered in 1590, so she was at least spared that. Her daughter Sibylle, the hard one, was the only child at her side at the end. The cause is given only as a prolonged illness alongside her mental decline. There's even some disagreement in the records about where exactly she was buried, with the German sources placing her in a collegiate church in Cleves, reportedly tucked beneath the organ with no grave marker at all, and an English source instead naming a church in Dusseldorf. An archduchess, daughter of an emperor, possibly laid to rest in an unmarked spot under an organ loft. The record can't even agree on where her body went. Of all the small mercies in this story, the timing of her death is the largest. She died in 1581. Her son's mind broke fully in 1590. The strangling in the tower happened in 1597. The exorcisms came after that. The line went extinct in 1609. Every single one of the worst things in this account happened after Maria was already in her grave. She was spared the sight of her last son raving about assassins, spared the murder of her daughter-in-law, spared the exorcisms in the castle where she herself had died, spared the extinction of the dynasty she'd given 7 children to, spared the war. She got out before the worst of it. Whatever was eating at her mind in those final years, the grief and the false guilt and the heavy spirits, at least it ended before the family's collapse reached its true depths. But she didn't get out unmarked. By the time she died, she had already buried a 5-year-old daughter and a 19-year-old son. She had spent 15 years married to a man whose body and mind the strokes had wrecked. She had married her eldest daughter to a man already losing his mind. She had run a duchy she had no authority to run, second-guessed at every turn. And she had, by the accounts, slid into a melancholy that deepened into something the sources call derangement, possibly tormented by the conviction that her marriage and her children were a sin against God over a thing that had never happened. She died with her hardest, coldest daughter beside her, in a castle by the Rhine, of an illness no one bothered to name precisely, and was buried somewhere the records can't even agree on, a daughter of an emperor, and we don't reliably know which church holds her bones. But the family she left behind kept falling, and the falling got worse, and Maria was spared the worst of it only by dying when she did. So we have to follow it past her death, because the full horror of this story is in what happened to the people she left. Her husband William lingered 9 more years in his ruined body, dying at the start of 1592. By then, their son Johann Wilhelm had been fully insane for 2 years, and the duchy was being governed by a terrified, fractured court trying to manage a mad duke. And it's here that we get to Jacobe of Baden and what was done to her, because it's genuinely one of the darkest things in the whole account. Jacobe was Johann Wilhelm's first wife, the bride from that glittering 8-day wedding in 1585. She was an orphan, raised strictly Catholic at the Bavarian court, married to Johann Wilhelm to bind the wavering duchy firmly to the Catholic side. She was intelligent and strong-willed, and when her husband's mind collapsed, she tried to step into the vacuum and take over the government herself. That made her enemies fast. The councillors resented her, and above all, her sister-in-law Sibylle, Maria's hard daughter, hated her, because Jacobi had displaced Sibylle as the dominant woman at court. What followed was a slow, deliberate destruction of a woman who had done nothing worse than try to hold power in a court full of people who wanted her gone. She arrived into an impossible situation. A young woman married into a foreign court, whose husband went mad within 5 years of the wedding, who looked around at a government with no functioning duke and tried to do the obvious thing, hold it together herself. But she was an outsider, a Bavarian, a woman, and the councillors and the duke's sister had no intention of letting her run anything. The harder she pushed to govern, the more dangerous she became to the people already there. And she was, by the accounts, not a meek personality. She fought for her position. In a court full of men who resented her and a sister-in-law who hated her, fighting for her position turned out to be the thing that got her killed. Starting in 1595, the power struggle broke fully open. At a regional assembly, Jacobi was accused of adultery, named with a nobleman, and accused of keeping her mad husband imprisoned unnecessarily. By imperial order, she was stripped of her role in government and locked in the tower of Dusseldorf Castle. Then they built the case against her. 90 formal charges, 90, most of them defamatory personal accusations dragged up and assembled into a legal assault, pursued before the imperial court. She sat in that tower while her enemies, with Sibylle among them, papered the walls of the legal record with everything they could invent about her. 90 charges. They didn't need 90 reasons to be rid of her. One would have done the legal work. The 90 was the point. It was a campaign of total annihilation, a deliberate burying of the woman under an avalanche of accusations, most of them personal, defamatory, designed not just to remove her from power, but to destroy her name, her reputation, her standing, everything. Adultery was the spearhead, because adultery was the charge that could, under the right reading of canon law, free her husband from the marriage. The other 89 were there to make her unsavable, to ensure that no one would defend her, that she would be so thoroughly slandered that her removal would seem like justice. And she sat in a tower room and could do nothing but wait while it was assembled around her. Underneath all of it sat the cold machinery. Under Catholic canon law, the only way Johann Wilhelm could be freed to remarry and produce the heir the dynasty desperately needed was if Jacobi died. As long as she lived, he was bound to her, childless, and the line was dying. So in August of 1597, the councillors brought a document to the insane duke and had him sign it, a document that effectively demanded his wife's removal. A man out of his mind, signing away his wife's life at the urging of the people who wanted her dead. Follow the logic all the way down, because it only makes sense to people who've stopped seeing a person and started seeing an obstacle. The dynasty needs an heir. The duke is mad but might recover enough to father one. He's already married to a woman who hasn't given him a child, almost certainly because of his condition rather than hers. Divorce isn't available under their faith. Annulment would take years and might fail. But death is permanent and immediate. A dead wife frees the duke to marry a new one who might bear the heir the line is dying for want of. So the woman in the tower stopped being a person with a claim to govern and became, in the cold accounting of the councillors, a problem with one clean solution. And they got the madman she was married to, the man whose imprisonment she'd been accused of arranging, to put his name to the paper that sealed it. On the morning of the 3rd of September, 1597, Jacobi was found dead in her bed. She had gone to sleep the night before in good health, having received guests, and even raised a toast to her husband's health, which has its own awful irony. The eyewitness reports describe marks on her neck. She had been suffocated or strangled, ligature marks around her throat, murdered in her locked tower room in a castle full of people who had every reason to want her gone, and the legal motive spelled out in canon law. The last night of her life she was, by the accounts, in good spirits, healthy, entertaining. She received guests in her tower room and at some point raised a glass to toast the health of her husband, the same husband whose signature was, weeks earlier, put to the document demanding her removal. She went to bed alive and well and woke up dead. Or rather didn't wake up at all, because sometime in the dark someone came into that locked room and put their hands or a cord around her throat and held it there until she stopped. A woman who'd toasted her mad husband's health a few hours before being strangled in a castle his sister effectively controlled. Nobody was ever caught. The murder was never officially proven. The emperor declined to order a full investigation, because a full investigation would have produced a scandal nobody at that level wanted. And the final insult came at her burial. A princess of the duchy, and they refused her an honourable funeral. On the evening of the 10th of September, she was buried without ceremony, without honours, away from the public eye, shoved into a church almost in secret. Her remains weren't given a dignified ceremonial reburial until 1820, more than 2 centuries later. The refusal of an honourable burial was the last act of the campaign that had destroyed her. They had slandered her with 90 charges, locked her in a tower, and strangled her in the dark, and then, in death, they denied her even the dignity her rank demanded. No state funeral, no procession, no public mourning for the Duchess. They put her in the ground, quietly, almost furtively, in the evening, out of sight, as if she were something to be disposed of rather than a princess to be mourned. The whole point was erasure. Strip her of power, strip her of reputation, strip her of life, and finally strip her of the ceremony that would have acknowledged she'd ever been anyone at all. It took until 1820, more than 200 years, before her remains were finally moved and reburied with the honors she'd been denied. By then, everyone who'd hated her was 4 centuries dead, and the murdered woman in the tower had become a legend, because she lingered, in Dusseldorf legend, as a ghost. The white woman, or the woman in black silk, said to haunt the castle tower where she was killed. The poet Heinrich Heine wove the story into his writing, and by one tradition the ghostly white lady even drifted, centuries later, into the imagery of a laundry detergent advertisement about the strangest afterlife a murdered princess could possibly have. It's a strange kind of immortality, becoming the ghost of the place where you were murdered. The people who killed her wanted her gone, erased, forgotten in an unmarked evening burial. Instead, she became the most enduring story attached to the castle, the pale figure haunting the tower, the murdered duchess who wouldn't leave. The men who strangled her are footnotes. Sibylle, who hated her, is remembered mainly for hating her. But Jacobi became a legend that outlasted all of them, the white woman of Dusseldorf, drifting through the tower in the stories people told for centuries after. There's no justice in it, exactly. A ghost story isn't justice. But the woman they tried hardest to erase turned out to be the one the place couldn't forget. Maria, mercifully, was 16 years in her grave when her daughter-in-law was strangled in that tower. She never knew. But it was her daughter Sibylle standing in the middle of it. After Jacobi was dead and out of the way, they got Johann Wilhelm a second wife. His condition had actually improved a little around 1597 under the care of an English physician summoned from Holland, improved enough that he could be let out of confinement and married again. In 1599 they married him to Antonia of Lorraine, another attempt to produce an heir before the line ran out. And this is where the story tips into something almost medieval in its desperation. Because this marriage too was childless, and so they turned to exorcism. Antonia walked into the same role Jacobi had died in, married to the same mad duke, charged with the same impossible task of producing the heir that would save the line. She seems to have been more careful or more fortunate than her predecessor. She secured an imperial order making her co-regent, managed for a time to steady the chaotic government, even pushed out a dangerous official who'd been preying on the situation. For a while she held things together better than anyone had a right to expect. But the central problem never moved. Her husband was mad, and the marriage produced no children, and as the years passed without an heir, the pressure that had killed Jacobi simply transferred onto the question of why this marriage, too, was barren. She had to know what had happened to the woman before her. Everyone knew. Jacobi had been locked in a tower and strangled in the dark, and now here was Antonia, married into the same family, to the same broken man, expected to do the one thing Jacobi couldn't, give the Duke a child. She must have understood on some level that her safety depended on success, that a barren second marriage left her in a version of the same trap. So she moved carefully, secured legal authority where she could, governed shrewdly. And still the marriage stayed empty. No child came, because no child was ever going to come from a man that far gone. And so they reached past medicine and past law to the last thing left, which was the priest, and the ritual and the casting out of demons. Both Johann Wilhelm and Antonia were subjected to lengthy exorcisms, rituals meant to drive out whatever demonic force was causing the madness and the barrenness. In 1605, with the backing of Antonia's father and the approval of the emperor himself, a major exorcism was carried out at Hambach Castle, the same castle where Maria had died, under a theologian physician brought in to perform it. The Duke's own doctors, including a son of the famous Johann Weyer, who had once written against the witch hunts from that very court, opposed the exorcism, argued against it, lost. Stand inside that scene for a moment, because it's one of the strangest in the whole story. Hambach Castle, where Johann Weyer had written his great book, arguing that what looked like demonic possession was really mental illness, that the women being burned as witches were sick, not damned. The same walls. And now, 50 years later, in those same rooms, a mad duke and his wife are being formally exorcised, prayed over, ritually cleansed of demons, on the theory that devils are causing his madness and their childlessness. And standing in the room objecting is Weyer's own son, a physician like his father, arguing that this is nonsense, that the Duke is ill and not possessed, that the ritual is useless, and he loses. They do the exorcism anyway, with the emperor's blessing. The rational tradition that had once made this court remarkable was overruled in its own birthplace by men who decided the answer was demons. So you have this scene, in the early 17th century, in the castle where the old duchess had died of melancholy, a mad duke and his wife being exorcised to cast out demons, while the physicians who knew better stood by objecting. The humane, rational court that Weyer had once worked in had curdled over a few decades into a place that tried to beat the devil out of a sick man with prayers and ritual. It didn't work, of course. Nothing worked. Johann Wilhelm stayed mad and stayed childless, sliding deeper into his frozen withdrawal, and on the 25th of March, 1609, he died. No children. The male line of the Dukes of Jülich-Klevsberg, Maria's husband's line, was extinct. And that's when the clause came back. The one buried in Maria's wedding contract in 1546, the emperor's little gift, the privilege that said William's daughters could inherit if the male line failed. The male line had now failed in the most complete way imaginable, in madness and strangulation and barrenness. And so all that wealth, all those strategically vital lands on the Lower Rhine, sitting right at the seam between Catholic and Protestant Europe, right where the great powers were about to start fighting, fell open to whoever could claim it through Maria's daughters. The two strongest claims ran through Maria's two eldest girls. Through Marie Eleanor, the one married to the mad Duke of Prussia, the claim passed to the Elector of Brandenburg. Through Anna, the happily married one, the claim passed to the House of Palatinate-Neuburg. Two Protestant-leaning German powers, both with a blood claim through Maria, both wanting the prize, and around them gathered everyone else. The Emperor, Spain, the Dutch Republic, France, England, all of them with a stake in who controlled that rich corner of the Rhine. It became the War of the Jülich Succession, which ran from 1609 and very nearly set off a general European war years before the one that eventually came. The King of France was preparing to march into it when he was assassinated in 1610, and his death is one of the things that kept the whole continent from going up early. It was finally patched, provisionally, by a treaty in 1614 that split the inheritance, Jülich and Berg going one way, Cleves and Mark and Ravensburg going to Brandenburg, planting the seed of what would one day grow into the Prussian state. The wealth that had earned William the nickname the Rich was largely gone by then, the lands trampled under marching armies again and again. And historians generally see the whole crisis as a kind of dress rehearsal for the 30 Years' War, the catastrophe that followed close behind and devoured Germany. The numbers involved tell you why everyone wanted it. These were some of the richest, most densely populated, most strategically placed lands in the German northwest. Thousands of square kilometers sitting right at the seam between the Catholic Empire and the Protestant Dutch, right where Spanish and Dutch armies had been fighting for decades. Whoever controlled them controlled a crucial stretch of the Rhine and a fortune in revenue. So when the Mad Duke died childless, the consequences ran far past the family. It became a prize that drew in every power with an interest in the region. The emperor wanted to control the succession. Spain wanted to keep the lands Catholic and friendly. The Dutch wanted them out of Spanish hands. France wanted to weaken the Habsburgs. England watched and meddled. Two German claimants, both descended through Maria's daughters, raced to occupy the territory. Armies gathered. And the only thing that kept it from exploding into a full continental war right then was a knife in Paris, the assassination of the French king as he prepared to march in 1610. So the bloodline Maria carried, the line running back to Joanna the Mad of Castile, ended exactly the way the people who love that detail say it was always going to end. In madness, in a murdered wife, in a childless duke dying in his locked decline, in a dynasty going extinct and a war breaking out over its corpse. The line didn't just fail, it detonated. And there's one final image almost too fitting about the very end of it. When Johann Wilhelm died in 1609, his body wasn't buried. Because the succession was disputed, because nobody could agree who had the authority to hold a state funeral while armies gathered to fight over his lands, his corpse was placed in a lead coffin in the castle chapel at Düsseldorf and simply left there for almost 20 years. The last Duke of the line lay unburied in a sealed lead box, while the world fought over what he'd left behind, and he wasn't finally laid to rest in a church until 1628, 19 years after his death. The mad heir whose madness ended everything, kept in a box because his death had created chaos that nobody could resolve. 19 years in a lead coffin in a chapel, the man whose breakdown unmade the dynasty couldn't even be buried, because the act of burying a duke was itself a political statement about who had the authority to do it, and no one could agree on that while the war over his lands ground on. So he waited. The corpse of the last Duke of Jülich-Cleves-Berg sat sealed in lead in the chapel at Düsseldorf through the whole war of the Jülich succession and into the early years of the 30 Years' War, an unburied symbol of everything that had collapsed until 1628, when someone finally had enough settled authority to put him in the ground. His mother had died 47 years before that, buried somewhere the records can't pin down. The two of them, mother and son, both ended up as bodies the history books can barely locate, one under an organ loft maybe, one in a box for 2 decades. The beginning and the end of the family's ruin, both of them hard to find. A historian who studied the mad princes of Renaissance Germany counted something close to 30 German dukes, landgraves, margraves, and counts, plus one Holy Roman Emperor, who were known in their own time as mad. Mad enough that serious steps had to be taken to remove them from power or to find them care. So Maria's family was not some bizarre outlier. Across the German lands, ruling houses were producing mad princes at a steady, alarming rate, and everyone had to figure out what to do with a man who could no longer rule, but couldn't simply be deposed because his blood was the blood that held the territory together. 30 of them. That's not a curse on one family. That's a pattern across an entire ruling class. And once you know that, Maria's household stops looking like a uniquely cursed bloodline and starts looking like one especially concentrated example of something happening everywhere. The German princely houses married each other relentlessly, generation after generation. The same few dozen families circling and recombining, cousins marrying cousins, the gene pool narrowing. They lived under enormous pressure, the constant demands of governing, of producing heirs, of holding their lands against rivals and against the great powers. And when minds broke under all of that, as they did with grim regularity, the families faced the same impossible problem every time. You cannot simply remove a mad prince because his person is the legal foundation of the whole territory. His blood is what makes the land his family's land. Depose him and you invite every rival to question whether the family has any right to rule at all. So you govern around him, you contain him, you keep up the fiction. You wait for him to die and hope the next one is sound. The treatments came out of humoral theory, the old idea that the body and mind were governed by 4 fluids, and that madness, melancholy especially, came from an excess of black bile. So the gentler end of treatment was about rebalancing that: sleep, fresh air, sunlight, exercise, cheerful servants to lift the patient's mood, which is humane enough, even if it did nothing. But when that failed, and it always failed, the remedies got stranger and grimmer. One genuine prescription of the period involved taking the entrails of a freshly killed snow-white dog and applying them to the patient's head. Drinks made of powdered pearls. Elaborate diets with strict rules about which meats to avoid. The flesh of stags and boar and hare and certain birds all forbidden. Paracelsian chemical concoctions. And at the far end, when medicine threw up its hands, exorcism, the assumption that what couldn't be cured must be a demon. Walk through that progression, because it's a portrait of helplessness dressed up as treatment. First, they try the pleasant things, the rest and sunlight and cheerful company, because the theory says a melancholic mind needs lightening. When that does nothing, they escalate to the strange ones, the powdered pearls dissolved in drink, the precise and useless dietary rules about which animal's flesh might be feeding the black bile. The snow-white dog, killed fresh, and opened and laid against the sick man's skull, the warm entrails supposedly drawing the bad humours out of his head, none of it touching the actual disease. And when the dog and the pearls and the diet all fail, when the mind keeps coming apart no matter what they pour into it or lay against it, the only explanation left in their framework is the supernatural. It must be a demon, so they call the priest. The whole sequence is the sequence of people who have no idea what's wrong and no power to fix it, working their way down a list of escalating desperation until they arrive at exorcism, just helplessness with a liturgy. That's the world Johann Wilhelm was treated in, strapped, in essence, into a system that would try cheerful servants and snow-white dog entrails and powdered pearls, and finally a priest casting out devils, none of it touching the actual illness eating his brain. And for William, the stroke victim, there was even less. A man paralyzed down one side, his speech ruined, his spine compressing, in an age with no real understanding of what a stroke even was. They could keep him comfortable, more or less. They could not help him. He simply endured, for 26 years, in a body that kept failing around a mind that the strokes had also damaged. Confinement was the other half of it, and confinement in this period was not gentle. A mad prince who couldn't be cured had to be contained, partly for his own safety, partly for everyone else's, partly to keep the constitutional fiction of his rule from collapsing into open chaos. So they were locked away, held in rooms, in towers, watched and restrained. The dignity of their rank bought them better cells than a common madman would get. But a cell is a cell. Johann Wilhelm was confined during his worst years. Albert Frederick of Prussia, Maria's son-in-law, was placed under regency and contained for decades. These were men who, in their right minds, had ruled territories and commanded armies and sat at imperial diets, and they ended their lives locked in rooms, raving or frozen, watched by keepers, while their wives and counselors governed around the empty space where their authority used to be. And around all of these afflicted people sat the cold political calculation that never stopped running. A mad duke or a paralyzed one wasn't only a human tragedy, he was a constitutional crisis. The councillors and estates had to govern around him, had to decide how much power to take and how much fiction of his rule to maintain. The whole apparatus of the state had to be bent around the broken body or broken mind at the center of it. That's why no one simply set William aside, and it's why Jacobi's attempt to take real power was so threatening that it got her killed. Power in these households flowed through the sick man, and everyone fought over the channel. Now I keep saying Maria sat at the center of all this, and I want to make that concrete because it's easy to let her vanish behind the more dramatic men. She spent the last 15 years of her life married to a man who had been struck down, who could not speak clearly, who could not stand without pain, and whose mind the strokes had clouded. Day after day in the same household with that. She did the work of keeping a duchy functioning without ever being given the authority to do it, every decision second-guessed by men who outranked her on paper. She raised her younger children in the shadow of their father's ruin. She received the news in 1575 that her brilliant eldest son had died of smallpox in a Roman sick room. She arranged her daughters' marriages, including handing her eldest girl to a man already visibly losing his mind, because that was the match available, and the alliance mattered. And underneath all of it, she carried her own quiet, sinking melancholy, the heavy spirits the source's name, possibly tangled up with that false religious guilt about whether her whole marriage had been a sin. Lay her years out plainly, and the weight of them is hard to hold. Married at 15 to a defeated duke who'd wanted her sister. 20 good years, and then her husband's body and mind start to fail and never stop failing. A 5-year-old daughter dead. 15 years nursing an invalid and running his duchy without permission. Her brilliant son dead of disease in a foreign city at 19. Her eldest daughter married to a madman. Her surviving son fragile and strange and clearly not well. And her own faith, the thing that had held her up her whole life, slowly turning against her, filling her nights with a guilt built on a falsehood. She was 50 when she died. She'd buried 2 children, nursed a ruined husband for a decade and a half, and watched the future of her family narrow down to a sickly son who would lose his mind within a decade of her death. The melancholy the sources describe wasn't a mystery. It was the only sane response to the life she'd been handed. Her piety was real, and it was constant. In a duchy that kept drifting toward Protestantism, she was the unwavering Catholic anchor, fighting to keep her children in the faith, fighting the confessional tide inside her own court. And there's something almost unbearable in the idea that the same deep religiosity that gave her strength may also have been the thing that broke her, if that scruple about her marriage really did take root and grow. The faith that held her up and the faith that tormented her. The same faith. The court she presided over had started as one of the more enlightened in the empire. Her husband's tolerance, the physician Via writing against witch hunts under their roof, the humanist tutors, the openness to both confessions. By the time her son was being exorcised in 1605, that court had become a place of paranoia, faction, judicial murder, and demon hunting. The whole thing soured over the span of Maria's adult life and the years just after it, going from one of the brightest spots in German princely culture to a cautionary tale of madness and collapse. And she lived through the turn. She watched it start to go. She arrived at that court as a 15-year-old in 1546 into a household that was prosperous, curious, humane, the home of a duke who sheltered a physician brave enough to say the witch burners were the real menace. She spent her best years there, bore her children there, anchored its Catholic faith there. And she watched it begin to curdle. She watched her husband's stroke hollow out the man at its center. She watched the religious factions harden and turn vicious. She watched the confident, tolerant place she'd married into start sliding towards something darker, and she did it while her own mind was sliding too. By the time she died, the slide was well underway. The murder in the tower, the exorcisms, the extinction and the war, all of that came after her. But the rot that produced it had set in while she was still alive to feel it. She got to see the bright court she'd joined as a girl begin to become the place that would strangle a duchess and try to cast devils out of her son. And then she was gone. And it finished becoming that without her. Let me give you the children's fates laid side by side one more time, because the pattern is the whole point, and it deserves to be seen clearly. Marie Eleanor, the eldest, married to a man whose mind collapsed and who lived for decades in derangement. Karl Friedrich, the brilliant heir, dead of smallpox at 19 in Rome. Anna, the one whose marriage actually worked, 40 years and 8 children, the rare bright thread. Magdalene, married into the same Palatine family, who would die in the very castle her mother died in. Sibylle, who hardened into the ruthless power at a collapsing court and helped destroy a woman who ended up strangled in a tower. And Johann Wilhelm, the last son, who went raving mad, signed away his wife's life, was exorcised, died childless, and lay unburied in a lead box for 19 years while a war was fought over his lands. 6 children who lived to grow up. One of them got something like a normal life. The rest were swallowed, each in their own way, by illness or madness, or the violence and paranoia that madness brought into the household around them. And every one of those fates was, at some point, a piece of news that reached Maria, or would have if she'd lived long enough. The smallpox death in Rome reached her in 1575 and helped break her. The marriage of her eldest daughter to a man already losing his mind was something she helped arrange, knowing or half knowing what she was sending her child into. She didn't live to learn that her last son would go mad, that her daughter-in-law would be strangled in a tower, that her hardest daughter would have a hand in it, that the dynasty would die and a war would start. She was spared the back half of the catalogue, but the front half, the dead daughter and the dead son and the mad son-in-law and her own sinking mind, that was already more than enough to fill a life with grief. She got the first half of the family's ruin and died before the second. Looking at the whole list now, knowing what came after, it's hard not to think the timing of her death was the kindest thing that happened to her. And the dynasty Maria married into, the rich and ancient line of Jülich-Cleves-Berg, was simply gone within a generation of her death. Extinguished, carved up at the negotiating table, the pieces handed to her grandchildren's families, the famous wealth burned away by passing armies, the whole proud territorial complex dissolved into the prehistory of bigger states. She gave that dynasty 7 children and her entire adult life, and within 30 years of her death, there was no male line left to inherit any of it. The genealogists like to close the loop back to Joanna of Castile, and I'll let you decide for yourself what to make of it, because I don't think the evidence supports drawing it as confidently as people do. Yes, Maria descended directly from the most famous mad queen in European history. Yes, her own end was a slide into melancholy and derangement. Yes, her son went violently insane, and her eldest daughter's husband and her daughter-in-law's husband, the same man, was lost to madness too. You can look at all of that and see a curse threading down through the blood, surfacing again and again, finally consuming the whole line. It's a powerful story, and it's not impossible. The trouble is that the same families who carried the supposed curse also carried the supposed cure, and neither one quite behaves the way a curse should. Maria's sister Joanna, born the same week their mother died, grew up to be a Grand Duchess in Italy and had her own share of misery but not madness. Plenty of Maria's relatives lived ordinary, sane lives. The madness didn't fall on everyone, didn't follow the blood in any neat, predictable way. It landed where it landed, on a stroke-damaged duke and a fragile second son and a melancholic, overburdened duchess, and the people who see a curse in it are mostly seeing it backward from the end, where the pattern looks cleaner than it ever did from inside the lives. But you can also look at it and see something simpler and in some ways heavier. A family relentlessly intermarried for political advantage, generation after generation, narrowing its own gene pool. A medical world that could do nothing for a mind or a body once it began to fail. An age that married teenage girls to defeated dukes and incompetent princes to seal treaties, that valued these people mainly for the heirs they could produce and the lands they could join together. A woman handed across a border at 15 as the price of a war, who did everything asked of her, bore the children, held the duchy together around her broken husband, kept the faith, and was slowly crushed flat by grief and fear, and an impossible weight of responsibility she was never actually given the power to carry. Maybe the blood of Joanna of Castile surfaced in her, or maybe she was just a kind, delicate, deeply religious woman who watched her son's brilliant future die in a Roman sick room, nursed a paralyzed husband for 15 years, married her own daughter to a man losing his mind, lay awake convinced her marriage was a sin against God over something that had never happened, and finally, at 50, in a cold castle by the Rhine, with only her hardest daughter beside her, let go of a mind that had simply held too much for too long. What stays with me about her, more than the curse theories and the genealogical charts, is how little of her own life she got to choose. She didn't choose to be born a Habsburg daughter in a family that bred wives the way other families bred horses. She didn't choose the husband twice her age who'd wanted her sister. She didn't choose to have her son die in Rome, or her other son lose his mind or her body to keep bearing children into a marriage she'd later torment herself believing was invalid. She did the things asked of her, all of them, faithfully, for 35 years, and the reward for all that obedience was grief stacked on grief until her mind couldn't carry it. The men around her are remembered for the loud, dramatic ways they fell apart. Maria is barely remembered at all, a few vague lines about a melancholic duchess, a disputed grave. She held the center of one of the darkest family collapses of the age, and history mostly looked straight through her. She was buried somewhere, possibly under an organ, possibly without a marker, and the records can't even agree which church. Her daughter-in-law would be strangled in a tower 16 years later. Her son would die mad and be left in a lead box for 19 years. And her wedding contract, that one generous clause about her daughters being allowed to inherit, would set armies marching across the Rhine before the smallpox that killed her eldest son had been forgotten by anyone who'd been alive to see it. All right, that's where Maria's story leaves us, and I'll be honest, this one stuck with me. There's no clean ending to give her. She got handed an impossible life and held it together as long as her mind would let her, and the world she lived in mostly looked past her toward the men falling apart on either side. If something about that landed with you, send this to one other person who'd sit through a story like this, because that's genuinely how these find the people they're meant for. Thanks for staying with me. I'll be back soon. Until then, Look after the people around you.